Hey everybody, welcome back. Donnie Eisenhower here. And today we're covering chapter 15, Landlord and Tenant. Now the good news is that this chapter is actually one of the easier chapters in the course. The challenge isn't the difficulty. The challenge is remembering just a handful of North Carolina laws and numbers that frequently show up on the exam. So today we're going to focus on landlord and tenant terminology, North Carolina rental laws, security deposits, evictions, types of leasehold estates, types of leases, common lease provisions, and we'll finish up with some rapid fire exam review. So let's jump in. Landlord and tenant basics. So let's start with some vocabulary here. A lease is a contract that gives the tenant the right to possess and use the property in exchange for rent. The landlord is called the lessor. The tenant is called the leasee. So remember this exam shortcut here. Lessor, landlord. Leasee, tenant. Lessor, landlord. Leasee, tenant. So the landlord owns the property, but the tenant receives possession of the property. That means both parties have legal right in the property at the same time. So ownership remains with the landlord, but possession belongs to the tenant. The distinction may show up later on in an exam. So there are 3 North Carolina laws that is important for us to understand. So number 1, North Carolina Residential Rental Act Agreement. That is the law that outlines the rights and the responsibility of landlords and tenants. The North Carolina Rental Act Agreements. That just outlines the rights and the responsibilities of the landlords and also of the tenant. Number 2, North Carolina Tenant Security Deposit Act. This law, they regulate security deposits, trust account requirements, deposit limits, and the refund procedures. The 3rd law is Vacation Rental Act. This applies to vacation rentals in short-term rental situations. If you see a question involving security deposits, think Tenant Security Deposit Act. If you see a question involving landlord and tenant duties, think Residential Rental Acts Agreement. So let's talk about landlord responsibilities. A landlord must provide a property that is safe, habitable, and fit for occupancy. So the landlord must maintain common areas. They got to maintain the plumbing. They got to maintain electrical systems, maintain heating systems, comply with building codes, and then also they need to install required smoke detectors. And so if the landlord fails to provide a habitable property, the tenant may have legal remedies. So remember, a landlord cannot simply ignore serious maintenance problems. They got to keep the structure and the property in good operating conditions. Now the tenant also has responsibilities. The tenant has responsibilities and they must pay the rent, keep the property reasonably clean, dispose of trash properly. They should avoid damaging the property and follow the terms that are laid out in the lease. The tenant is responsible for damages that's beyond the normal wear and tear. Normal wear and tear is not tenant damage. And so examples of this would be of normal wear and tear would be worn carpet and minor scuff marks and fading paint. But a tenant damage is example of hole in the walls, broken windows, and broken doors. So let's talk about the eviction process. Actual eviction versus constructive eviction. This is a knowledgeable topic here because actual eviction occurs when the tenant breaches the lease. This is most commonly found in non-payment of rent and violating the lease terms. the landlord uses the court process to remove the tenant. Understand, the landlord uses the court process to remove the tenant. Now, constructive eviction, what that is, that occurs when the landlord breaches a lease. An example of this would be the roof leaks and the landlord refuses to repair it. The home becomes unlivable. The tenant is effectively forced to leave. So remember, actual eviction equals the tenant's fault. Constructive eviction equals the landlord's fault. So let's talk about something now that can happen, and that is called self-help eviction. This is a huge topic to understand. This one you need knowledge on. North Carolina does not allow for self-help eviction. What this means is the landlord changes the locks. They shut off utilities. They remove tenant belongings, and they physically force the tenant out. The legal eviction process must go through the courts using a summary objection. So remember this, self-help eviction is illegal in North Carolina. Cannot do it. A landlord cannot do it. So if you see a question where the landlord changes the locks or disconnects the power, that is self-help eviction. The process must go through the courts using summary objection. So now let's talk about security deposits. Know these numbers. Under the North Carolina Tenant Security Deposit Act, the week-to-week lease maximum deposit is 2 weeks. If it's month-to-month, the maximum deposit is a month and a half of rent. Longer than month-to-month lease, maximum deposit is 2 months rent. So let's do an example here. Month rent is $1,500. A 1-year lease, the maximum security deposit that is allowed is 2 months rent. So it's $1,500 times 2. That gives you $3,000. So now let's talk about gross lease versus net lease. Another topic that you need to know from this chapter. A gross lease is that the tenant pays one fixed rent amount. The landlord pays the taxes, they pay the insurance, they maintain the property, and they maintain the operating expense. This is a typical residential lease. So remember, gross lease is grossly simple. The tenant pays rent, the landlord pays everything else. Now let's talk about a net lease. This is more common in residential commercial real estate. The tenant pays the rent, but they also pay the taxes. They pay the insurance, and they pay for maintenance of the property. The tenant carries more of the expenses of the property. Now let's talk about leasehold estates. You may want to know these next four. You've got estates for years. That is a definite begin and a definite end date, and it automatically terminates on the end date. No notice is required. For example, January 1 through December 31st, that's a beginning and an end date, no renewal. You have a periodic tenancy that automatically renews, such as a month-to-month or a week-to-week, or it could even be a year-to-year. It continues until proper notice is given. There is a estate at will. There is no definite end date. Generally can be terminated by either party. There is also a estate at sufferance. Estate at sufferance. This is a holdover tenant. The lease has expired, but the tenant stays anyway. So remember, holdover tenant is estate at sufferance. Estate at sufferance. Now let's talk a little bit about vacation rental expedited eviction. This is something that is specifically highlighted in chapter review. So vacation rental evictions, they can move fastly, they can move quickly because the terms are typically shorter rent time. And so this process requires a 4-hour notice, and the hearing takes place within approximately 12 to 48 hours. That's much faster than the traditional eviction process. So you'll see this in vacation rentals. When you see this, think fast eviction process. So what are some common lease provisions? Every valid lease should contain a mutual agreement, legal capacity, consideration, legal purpose, property description, and terms and conditions. Without these essentials, you may have problem enforcing the lease. So y'all, let's finish up here with some quick practice questions. Who owns the property? Who owns the property? The landlord. The landlord. Who has possession? The tenant. The tenant. Can a landlord shut off utilities to force a tenant out? No, they cannot. That is illegal self-help eviction. Maximum security deposit on a month-to-month lease. The answer is 1.5 months rent. 1.5 months rent. Maximum security deposit on a year lease. Maximum security deposit on a 1-year lease. The answer is 2 months rent. And then what types of lease is most common in residential property? The answer is gross lease. What type of tenancy automatically renews? Periodic tenancy. What is a holdover tenant? That is an estate at sufferance. Estate at sufferance. What causes constructive eviction? The landlord. Who causes actual eviction? The tenant. What eviction process requires 4-hour notice and a hearing within 12 to 48 hours? Vacation rental expedited eviction. Y'all, that's chapter 15. If you remember security deposit limits, self-help eviction is illegal, gross lease, estate for years, periodic tenancy, estate at sufferings, vacation rental expedited eviction, you'll be in great shape for chapter 15 exam questions. So don't forget, download the worksheet in the link below. And I would love it if you would take a moment and to subscribe to the channel. And follow me on Facebook. I would love to connect with you. And as always, I am here to help you from licensing to close.